All right. Good morning, everyone. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 7 today. Daniel's vision of the four beasts. So have you ever been reading a book or watching a movie and it seems like as it's progressing through, the good guys are winning, they're defeating the bad guys, everything's looking good, and then they reach a point in the middle where all of a sudden things start to turn around. Maybe the good guys are caught, captured, or something happens where suddenly things don't seem to be looking so good for the good guys, and it seems like the bad guys will win. And you start to wonder, what's going to happen? Is this going to turn out all right? How are things going to turn out? And that's exactly what the Jews during Daniel's time were probably wondering. Here they had this prosperous country that God was blessing, and they were adding more land under King David and King Solomon, and they were defeating their enemies. Things were going really well, and then things started to just go downhill, and it kind of reached a bottom with the captivity. And now they were in a foreign land with no plans to return, at least at this time, and they were probably wondering, has God forgotten them? Will the bad guys be victorious in the end? Will God's people have victory? And so here we have the prophet Daniel, and the Lord gives him these visions and explains to him what's going to happen in the future. And the Lord reveals to him that it's not going to always be this way. Things have to happen. Things have to progress. There will be more nations and evil empires that will rise and fall, but ultimately God will be victorious and he will set up his kingdom at the end. And so with that, I'd like you to turn to chapter 7, if you're not already there, and we'll take a look at this. And this is the first half of Daniel is mostly narrative, dealing with events in the life of Daniel. And then the second half is more prophecy and God revealing to Daniel what's going to happen in the future. So we come to the prophetic portion of Daniel, starting with chapter 7. And we'll go ahead and read the chapter, and we'll start in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before whom 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So to review, the theme of the book of Daniel is that God is in control of the world. World empires will come and go, will rise and fall, until the Lord sets up his eternal kingdom, which has no end. And it's our job to be faithful and obedient to him until he comes. And specifically this chapter, unlike previous chapters that kind of focused on the character of Daniel, this is more focusing on some attributes of God and how he is faithful to us, and he is omniscient. He knows what's going to happen in the future, and he will keep his promises. So with that, we'll get right into the explanation here of what's going on. It says in verse 1, the first year of Belshazzar. So it's going back a little bit from the last chapter. The last couple chapters actually were described the end of the Babylonian Empire and how the Medo-Persians came in and took over. But now we're going back to when Babylon was still in power under King Belshazzar. And although it's hard to pinpoint an actual date, the conventional date that scholars say is about 553 BC, so around 50 years after the captivity. So Daniel would have probably been in his 60s or 70s at this point. So we can see from this vision of the 4 beasts, it's describing 4 empires, and these correspond to the vision of the statue back in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had. And we'll look a little bit at the comparison as we go through. Obviously, the same 4 kingdoms are being described here, along with God's final kingdom that takes away the dominion of all these kingdoms and is in control at the end. And there's some details that we'll see that kind of correspond between the two visions. But there's also some major differences between them. For one, the statue uses the symbols of different metals or materials to describe the different kingdoms, whereas this just uses animals. And we can kind of see from man's perspective, he sees that empires are these great things. They're shiny and strong, and just, you could use metals to think of that in terms of metals, whereas from God's perspective, these are animals that are ferocious, they're devouring, they don't have any sense of morality. They just, when they see another animal in its path, they will attack it and eat it. And that's kind of how God views the empires of the world. And there's also more focus on the fourth kingdom in this chapter compared to chapter 2 with the statue. So we'll go through some explanations of kind of some of these symbols that he uses. Obviously, there's beasts here. A beast is the word just is a typical word for animal, just in general, usually used for wild animals as opposed to domesticated livestock. And it represents a nation over a period of time. A head, this is just the usual word for head, signified leadership, just as in English, our word head can signify that. When someone is head over a group or organization or company, they're in charge. So a head here represents a king or a kingdom. And we also have horns. They are symbol of power. We see this symbolized other places in the Bible. I'll give you an example. In Psalm 18:2, it says, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." When you think of animals with horns, you don't want to get close to them. You just leave them alone. And animals that with horns that go against each other, usually the ones with the bigger horns will win. So in the imagery of the book of Daniel, a horn seems to signify a single king or kingdom that is part of a nation and that's ruling concurrently with other kingdoms, other horns. So let's look at the four beasts. So one thing I want to point out, what's interesting about why God would have chosen these three animals. Obviously, the fourth one isn't named, but we'll talk about a little bit about the three that are named. Just if you think about it, what do they have in common? Well, you think about what are the largest, or were the largest land carnivores in ancient Israel. The biggest was the bear, or specifically the Syrian bear. The second was the lion, and the third was the leopard. So these are basically the three animals that were at the top of the food chain in ancient Israel. They're animals you don't want to mess with. And they are very powerful, ferocious animals. And so they kind of describe the empires that they're signifying are very powerful empires that devour other nations. So, and one verse that kind of shows just this idea of conquest that these are representing is, and you don't have to turn there, I'll just read it for you. Hosea 13:7-8 actually mentions all three of these animals. And it's talking about the Lord bringing up judgment on Israel, the nation of Israel. He says, "So I will be to them like a lion, Like a leopard by the road I will lurk. I will meet them like a bear deprived of her cubs. I will tear open their rib cage, and there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beasts shall tear them. So this idea of nation overpowering another nation that's weaker and assimilating them into their empire. So the first beast we have, and I will show, if you can remember the image of the statue from chapter 2, I'll show these the beasts from this vision along with that. So we have the lion that represents Babylonian Empire, and that corresponds to the head of gold in the statue. And just like gold, lions are very majestic creatures, and it kind of represents the splendor of ancient Babylon. And I can show you a few images of, these are just artistic renderings of what may have looked like, but that was a city of Babylon. Very impressive structures, especially under King Nebuchadnezzar. Obviously, we have the Tower of Babel, which was rebuilt under King Nebuchadnezzar. And then the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as well. So this was a very magnificent empire. We also have the Ishtar Gate, which actually part of that exists today. And it's kind of interesting. This is actually a real photograph. If you look up close, it depicts lions. So kind of interesting that they used the symbol of lion to represent their strength. And so this was the first empire, and this was the current empire that when Daniel had this vision. And lions are used several times in the Bible to depict a nation going against another nation. And it's interesting that it says this lion had eagle's wings. Let's see. So eagles are also represented as nations that go against another nation. In Deuteronomy 28:49, for example, it says, the Lord will bring a nation against you, Israel. God's talking to Israel, saying if they disobey, this is how he's going to judge them. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand. And we also have another example in Ezekiel 17, where it actually represents Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, as an eagle. So the idea of the eagle's wings just convey this idea of speed, that it goes through and just swoops down and attacks a nation without the nation even being able to really respond. Now it mentions the wings being removed. I watched till its wings were plucked off. And this could refer, if you remember back in chapter 4, when King Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated, God caused him to act like an animal and eat grass like an ox for 7 years, and just kind of humbled him. That could be what it's referring to. And it says, it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So instead of an animal that doesn't really have a sense of morality, now we have a man's heart. Humans understand morality. They understand, or at least they have the capacity to understand who created them and understand God and who's really in charge. And we see that with King Nebuchadnezzar after he was humiliated. He gave the glory to God, and he recognized. Yes, yeah. I think the next one is talking about the next beast. So this is all talking about King Babylon. So the king of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. So next is the bear, and that represents the Medo-Persian Empire. corresponds to the chest and arms of silver with the statue. And the Medo-Persian Empire, just like a bear, was massive. Syrian bears, they're almost the biggest bear in the world. They weigh up to 1,100 pounds, which is twice that of a lion. And in a similar way, the Persian Empire was about 10 times the estimated size of the Babylonian Empire. One of the largest empires in the world at that time. And they had a population estimated 50 million people compared to 1 million that Babylon had. And they had a pretty impressive army of 150,000 men, which was pretty big also for that time in history. Some estimates even are higher, up to 250 or 300,000. And it describes this bear as having 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Now, there's different interpretations of this, and the one that seemed to make the most sense to me is, since we're going along with this concept of animals devouring other animals, similar to nations conquering other nations, it seems like these 3 ribs might represent 3 other nations that they conquered. And the biggest nations that the Medes and the Persians conquered were Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. All 3 of those were world powers at each in their own time. And it says, "Arise, devour much flesh." So this bear is devouring, and bears do that. They typically, since they eat smaller things like fish and small animals and berries, they are eating all the time, sometimes up to 20 hours a day, especially right before they go into hibernation. And in a similar way, the Persian Empire, over its history, conquered many different nations and cities, and was just continually assimilating new peoples and lands into its empire. And then third, we have the leopard, which represents the Greek Empire, and that corresponds to the waist and thighs of bronze in the statue. And when we think of a leopard, we think of it is a smaller animal than the lion and the bear, quite a bit smaller, but it's very cunning and it acts with speed and cleverness. And we see that with when Alexander the Great, who was king over the Greek Empire, when he conquered Medo-Persia, he was much smaller, and his army was outnumbered over 2 to 1, but he was able to outsmart the Persians and attack them where they were weakest. And he did it with amazing speed. In only a couple years, he had pretty much conquered the entire Persian Empire. And we see this leopard is described as having 4 wings of a bird and also 4 heads. And this symbolizes how when Alexander the Great, after he had conquered Persia, it was only a couple years later that he died suddenly, and he was still fairly young, and he hadn't appointed a successor to his empire. So it instead, it broke into 4 different parts, and each part went to 4 of his most powerful generals. And they continued on, and the Seleucid Empire was one of the 4, and that was the most prominent one, and that will be more described in more detail in the next chapter. But anyway, we can see that the Greek Empire kind of continued on as those 4 different nations. And then the 4th beast there's not a specific animal named here. It's described as being dreadful and terrible. And to me, that leads me to believe it's much bigger than the other beasts and scarier and more ferocious. So I have just depicted as a dragon there. And it says it had huge iron teeth, which corresponds to the legs of iron in the statue. And it was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling with the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So the 10 horns, as we said before, they are 10 kings that are in this kingdom. And so let me back up a little bit. So this represents the Roman Empire, but it's honing in on the future revival of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was pretty fierce, and they did conquer a lot of different countries, but it wasn't necessarily totally different than what these other empires, how they acted and how they conquered. So that leads me to believe that this is focusing more on this revival of the Roman Empire in the future. So it describes it having 10 horns. And as we said, the horns represent kings that are ruling together, or nations that are ruling together. Some interpret this as a succession of Roman emperors. But when we can see in the next verse, 3 horns were subdued by this other king that comes in. So it seems to make more sense that these are 10 kings ruling at the same time. And then, as it says, another king comes in and subdues 3 of the kings. And we know from later visions in Daniel and Revelation that this represents the Antichrist. So this beast is described as devouring. It's the same word used for the bear, and represents how they will conquer many nations. But it also describes them as trampling down with its feet, and that's also symbolized by the feet of the statue. Refers to destruction. Not only will they conquer these nations, but they will destroy, and they will it will be a very rough time during the tribulation when this will happen. And this word trampling is also used in the next chapter, referring to the desolation of the temple. And it also describes it, so devouring, trampling, and persecuting. It describes this kingdom as persecuting the saints, people of God. The Aramaic word literally means to wear out. And it gives a time frame in verse 25. And the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Refers to 3.5 years. That's the common interpretation of this. Time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and a half a time is a half. So 1 plus 2 plus a half is 3.5 years. And we know from Revelation and later in Daniel that this refers to the second half of the tribulation. But that's not the end. Fortunately, there's still more to come. And although that seems pretty depressing when we think about it, God is in control, and he will not let that last forever. Fortunately, it only lasts for a short time. And so after these 4 beasts, these 4 kingdoms, it describes God's kingdom. And there's 2 individuals described here. One is the Son of Man. In verse 13, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we know that is Jesus Christ. And he even refers to himself as the Son of Man multiple times in the Gospels. That seemed to be his preferred way of referring to himself, and it kind of emphasizes his humanity. Yes, he is God, but he did come to earth as a man, and he, even though he does have a resurrected body, it's still human. It's a human body that he has, and we're able to see him and recognize him as a human, and it shows that when we believe on him and accept his gift of salvation, that we will be resurrected at the end as he was. And I'll just give you one verse where he used this term in Matthew 24:30. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And definitely the disciples and the people the other Jews that he was talking to would have recognized that he is referring back to Daniel. And this is at the end of the tribulation when he conquers the Antichrist and he comes with the armies in heaven, and he is given dominion over the whole earth. And the other individual that's mentioned is the Ancient of Days. And this seems to be God the Father. And this term Ancient of Days seems to emphasize the deity of God and how he has existed forever and he will exist forever and he existed before anything else on earth. In Psalm 91-2, it says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And it describes him as judging the nations. So he destroys the fourth beast in verse 11. I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And we see this in Revelation 19, verse 20. Then the beast, or the Antichrist, was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. Now, it's interesting that he allows the other beasts to continue. It says, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now, you think about it, well, didn't these empires die out a long time ago? Well, they did, but there's still the spirit of the empire that kind of lives on. And we can even see this with the three empires, the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and Greek Empire. They still have remnants today. With the Babylonian Empire, that was absorbed into the Persian Empire as a province. And that province, there is still a province in Iraq today called the Babel province, or Babylon. And when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian army under Darius III, and Darius III was mortally wounded, he personally told Alexander the Great that he was making him the heir to the Persian Empire. So he was basically assuming the title of Persian Empire, emperor, after he defeated Darius. So that the idea of the Persian Empire kind of lived on, even through the Greek Empire, even many, many hundreds of years later. And it's interesting that Iran was referred to as Persia up until 1935. It's not even 100 years ago, it was still recognized as Persia. And then, of course, Greece, well, we still have the nation of Greece today, so that pretty much speaks for itself. And these countries, in some form or another, will continue to the end and even last into the millennium. And there is there are other places in the Bible that describe other nations on the earth during the millennium. Obviously, Jesus will be ruling over the land of Israel, a much larger and expanded nation of Israel in the millennium. And he will have authority over all nations, but these other nations will continue to exist in some form under his authority. And if you want to read more about that, in Isaiah 12, for example, it describes Egypt and Assyria as being friendly toward Israel in the end time during the millennium. And that has not happened yet. Those countries, those areas have been fairly hostile to Israel and the Jews ever since the Bible times. So to kind of summarize, I'll kind of go through again, just real quick, the timeline here. So we have the captivity of Judah. Israel was taken captive, and this is where when Daniel was receiving these visions, they were captive in Babylon. And we have the Babylonian Empire. It was defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire, and that continued on. That was succeeded by the Greek Empire. That was succeeded by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was eventually defeated. The Western Roman Empire is split into the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was defeated in the 5th century by the Germanic tribes. The Eastern Roman Empire continued on as the Byzantine Empire until 1453, when it was defeated by the Muslim armies in the Ottoman Empire. And then we know that it will be revived in the future. During the tribulation period, it will have it will be very powerful. It will have a government of 10 kings or 10 nations. 3 of those kings will be subdued by the Antichrist, who will kind of take control for the last half, at least, of the tribulation, the last 3.5 years. And then Jesus will return with his armies in heaven and will set up his kingdom in the land of Israel. Will throw the Antichrist in the lake of fire, and then he will reign for 1,000 years. Now, there are other details in there. There's, rapture, the church, the gospel. Those weren't revealed to Daniel yet, so he was a little fuzzy on exactly how that was all supposed to work. We know from the New Testament books that we have a more clear picture of how those are all, that all is supposed to take place. But up till this point, things are still being revealed and more details are being given. As I mentioned in the next chapter, there's more details of the 4th Empire. And then there will be even more details on the end, the timeline of the end, as we get into the final chapters of Daniel. And I just want to kind of conclude. I just want to, again, read verse 14. And this is really what gives us our hope and why this all matters. It's one thing to know, okay, that's great that these empires will rise and fall. But to know that it's not going to be forever, that ultimately God will be in control of everything. It says then in verse 14, then to him, Jesus Christ, Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion